In this video, we will go over how to simplify radicals. You will not get decimals for these problems. So before we begin, we want to go over our perfect squares so you have these memorized. So if I give you the numbers 1 through 12, it's important that you have memorized what each of these numbers squared would be. So for example, 1 squared would be 1, 2 squared would be 4, 3 squared would be 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared is 49, 8 squared is 64, 9 times 9 is 81, 10 times 10 is 100, 11 squared is 121, and 12 squared is 144. Today, you're going to be going backwards, so you need to know that the square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 4 is 2, square root of 9 is 3, and so on. So if you need to write these down and memorize them, that's probably a good idea. You're going to want to use these numbers as much as possible. If you can use a perfect square when simplifying radicals, it'll make your life a lot easier. Let's look at our first example. We are trying to simplify the square root of 75. Your goal should be to try to break down 75 using one of our perfect squares. You actually want to use the biggest perfect square possible. So for 75, the biggest perfect square that will go into 75 is 25. Here's what we're going to do with that. We are going to break down 75 using 25 and 3. Then you want to break this down as far as you can. The square root of 25 is 5. So your goal here is to find any pairs. Your pairs are going to go outside of the square root, and what's left over is going to stay inside the square root. So here's how you would write your answer. The 5 is going to come outside. The 3 is going to stay inside. The square root of 75 is equivalent to 5 square root 3. We take out pairs because that's the meaning of square rooting something. Let's look at our next example. The square root of 200. Your goal should be to use this list as much as possible. The biggest number that will go into 200, the biggest perfect square that will go into 200 is 100. So what I would do is break down 200 using 100 and 2. Well, the square root of 100 is 10. So I have a pair of 10s with a 2 left over. My final answer, remember pairs come out, what's in the box stays underneath. It would be 10 square root 2. Let's look at what would happen if you didn't use a perfect square to break down 200. So let's say I decided to use 20 and 10. This actually will give you the same answer. So it's okay if you don't use a perfect square. If you don't use a perfect square, you just have to make sure you break it down completely. So 20 would simplify to 5 and 4, and 4 would simplify to 2 and 2. 10 would simplify to 5 and 2. So if you look, I have a pair of 2s, I have a pair of 5s, and I have a 2 left over. I'm not using the 20, 10, or the 4 because those numbers got broken down. So I have a pair of 5s that come out, I have a pair of 2s that come out, and I have a 2 left underneath. Once you take out the 5 and 2, when you multiply those together, you end up getting the exact same answer, 10 square root 2. So it's okay if you don't always use a perfect square. Just make sure you break it down all the way. Square root 48. The biggest perfect square that will go into 48. If you need to look at your list, you can. But the biggest perfect square that goes into 48 would actually be 16. If you break down 48 using 16, we would have 16 and 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So I have a pair of 4's with the 3 left over, meaning my answer is 4 square root 3. Once you have a pair, you can stop and circle it. You don't have to keep breaking it down. Go ahead and pause the video, try this one on your own, and then we'll check it together. The biggest perfect square that will go into 40 is 4. So to break down 40, I would use 4 and 10, and the square root of 4 is 2. Now, if you break down the 10 here, you're going to have a 2 and a 5. Those don't pair up with anything, so they're going to stay underneath the square root. The way you would write your final answer is the 2 would come out, and the 2 and the 5 would stay underneath. So my final answer is 2 square root 10. Pairs come out, everything else stays underneath. For 3 square root 72, the biggest perfect square that will go into 72 is 36. So I would use 36 and 2. The square root of 36 is 6. So I have a pair of 6's with the 2 left over. And then I have a 3 already outside. Here's what you're going to do with that 3. When you take the 6 out, you are just going to multiply it by the 3 that's already there. So my final answer would be 18 square root 2. For our next one, I have negative 4 times the square root of 243. Let's say you couldn't figure out what perfect square would go into 243. You can really use any two numbers to break this down. So I would use 3. If you divide this by 3, you can use 3 and 81, which this actually works out because 81 is a perfect square. The square root of 81 is 9, so I have a pair of 9's with the 3 left over. Don't forget about the negative 4 that's already outside. You are going to multiply that by the 9 that you're taking out. So your final answer here is negative 36 square root 3. Last thing we're going to talk about is if you have an exponent of 1/2. When you have an exponent of 1/2, this is just another way to write square root. So this 100 to the 1/2 power is the same thing as writing the square root of 100. Well, the square root of 100 is one of our perfect squares. The square root of 100 is 10. Since 10 times 10 equals 100, those both pair up. So you're not going to write square root 10. You are going to just write 10. When you have a perfect square, the square root sign will go away. For our last one, 8 to the 1/2 power is just the same thing as taking the square root of 8. If I break down 8, you can use 4 and 2, and the 4 breaks down to 2 and 2. So I have a pair of 2's with a 2 left over. The way you would write your final answer here is 2 square root 2. So for this lesson, the main thing you need to remember is to use your perfect squares if possible. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. It'll still work out. You need to remember that the pairs will go outside. What's left stays inside. This is the first part of today's lesson. Going on from here, you're going to solve equations using the square root method.